Today, we are happy to welcome William Frank, who is going to speak on The Disappearing Frame, a story of stained glass and architecture. William lives in St. Louis. He works for Emil Fry, and he does glass art and other kinds of art, I guess. He's earned a 2020 IFRA award. He's currently working on a project with his children, which I hope that he'll just give us a preview into at the end. I'd love to hear about that. And he is interested in the relationship between windows and architecture. Many communities find themselves looking to salvage and reuse historic windows. How do we do that and still maintain a relationship between stained glass and architecture? So, William, thank you for coming today.
Thank you. And, I'd like to thank the ACLS for inviting me. I spend most of my days immersed in my work, completing projects. So I'm grateful for opportunities like this to step back and contemplate what my work means and how it intersects with artistic traditions and the broader concerns of and trends of our particular time. Let me pull up some slides. Can you all see? Okay. Well, as Pam mentioned, I'm an artist, and I would say I'm particularly excited about projects that tell stories, engage communities, and bring together different design disciplines. So this work here is a sampling of my artwork I've made over not too many years, but enough years. Some of them as liturgical commissions, some personal and some for exhibitions. In a glimpse, this gives you a sense of the range of my work, different mediums, different subject matter, different styles, and different scales. Today, I'm going to take the focus off of my own work and off the specific content, images, and scenes of particular artworks, and put the emphasis or the focus on the aesthetics of how a stained glass window responds to an architecture. And I'd like to give a nod to philosopher Carsten Harries for the title of my webinar, The Disappearing Frame. Harries delivered a series of lectures called The Broken Frame to Catholic University of America, I believe around 1990. I first discovered these writings as a graduate student some 20 years later. In the final lecture, Harries points to a little known engraving, The Dear Morning by Johann Esaias Nelson. The engraving is notable because of the strangely positioned and incomplete frame. This engraving, Harries writes, in this engraving, the threshold that separates our modern aesthetic approach from an older approach becomes visible. Now, I'm not going to do a deep dive into Harries' broken frame. You can read it on your own. It's good. But his essay is striking because he identifies something in the periphery, this little known print. But it's expressive of some deep and broader concern. So for me, Harries' broken frame planted the seeds for some of my thoughts on windows and frames that I'll share with you today. And that is perhaps the frame that lies on the border of a stained glass window can be as instructive to us as the scenes and symbols in the windows themselves. And I think this is a timely topic because of an increased appetite and let's call it traditional art, and the increasing availability of Neo-Gothic and Munich Pictorial windows due to church closures across the United States. I believe the design and engineering of suitable window frames to receive these types of windows remains largely underdeveloped. So I'll begin by discussing in broad strokes stained glass windows as a handmaiden of architecture. From there, I'll look at three specific projects that can show us something about the relationship between architecture and stained glass today. First, I'll focus on a little known church in Webster Groves, Missouri, where a designer negotiated this relationship in the 1950s. Second, I'll talk about a new project in Mobile, Alabama, where a designer has successfully re-emphasized the importance of the frame in new construction. And third, I'll conclude with a contemporary chapel in St. Louis, Missouri. In his essay, The Symbolic Bible of the Middle Ages, architect Francis Palmer Smith calls stained glass the handmaid of architecture and not a mere archaic survival. The Episcopal Cathedral of St. Philip in Atlanta, Georgia is widely considered Smith's masterpiece. Interestingly, the planning for the cathedral began in the 1930s, but construction didn't begin until 1960. When I think of that timeline, only 60 years ago, I can't help but remark that we've seen such a massive shift in our design, trades, and construction methods in really such a short period of time. And I reference Smith's claims because I find it a timely challenge. He was working in a time and in an architectural style that garners renewed interest today. But regardless of style, something in the claim, stained glass is the handmaid of architecture, rings true. At root, I think, is the spiritual and theological significance of light. That is to say, stained glass is only a handmaiden of architecture insofar as it shapes light. Windows, frames, and light are things which most of us take for granted. For this reason, I think it's helpful to, before I launch into everything, to pause a moment and briefly reconsider and maybe define these elements. What is a window? At its most basic, a window is an opening in a structure that admits light. We typically think of a window as being a certain height and width, but of course a window has a specific depth as well. A window is a threshold between inside and outside, and a mediator between light of the sun and the shade of roof and wall. Architect Johanni Palasma argues that with the advent of artificial light and enormous plate glass windows, the window has lost some of its significance. In our time, the window has lost its significance, he writes, as a mediator between two worlds, between enclosed and open, interiority and exteriority, private and public, shadow and light. Having lost its ontological meaning, the window has turned into a mere absence of wall. Well, if any medium has the ability to return a window to its ontological meaning, I submit that stained glass has this ability. And if any building type is poised to help windows reclaim their ontological meaning, it's the church building. What is a frame? A frame establishes the borders of a thing. In the case of works of art, paintings, windows, etc., it is applied, paintings, frescoes, etc., it's applied to the art in order to present the artwork as an aesthetic object. Speaking of paintings, philosopher Karsten Harries argues that a frame provides a psychic distance from which a viewer can suspend disbelief and enter into what is represented. He explains, part of the evolution of modern painting has been the progressive elimination of the frame. Such elimination is closely tied to abstraction that transforms paintings from representations into self-sufficient aesthetic presences that no longer need the help of frames. Frames and representation, he says, in art go together. And I think what Harries observes about frames and paintings can also be said of frames and stained glass windows. Light. Stained glass is distinctive because it works with transmitted light. Most other art forms, oil painting, mosaic, fresco, these use reflected light. Think of a prism. A natural light enters from one side and passes through. The prism splits the various wavelengths of light into their separate forms. A stained glass window acts like a large prism. Each different color of glass acts like a filter, allowing only certain wavelengths through. It's an incomplete shadow, if you will. One philosopher has defined this type of light as a filtered shadow and gives the effect the name filto. Stained glass, when we view it this way, is a reductive medium. It takes away light. As the sculptor carves away stone, the stained glass artist carves away wavelengths of light. I think the great paradox of the medium is this: while stained glass is a reductive art form, it adds a new experience to the space and light. Light has a powerful effect on us. We're diurnal creatures, and we're tuned to the rising and setting of the sun. In Christianity, we're familiar with the image given to us in Scripture of Jesus as the light of the world. From the first moment of creation through the revelation of John, our God is the God of light. Appropriately, then, the image of Jesus as the light of the world has been used in art and architecture. For example, we have the term ad orientem. Many people hearing this will think of a priest facing the altar while saying Mass, as opposed to facing the people, the congregation, which is referred to as versus populum. Really, though, ad orientem refers to the priest's east-facing orientation, not the fact that he faces an altar or away from the congregation. Many churches are built so that the altar faces east. This orientation associates the rising of the sun with the coming of Christ. And in this way, when it comes to ad orientem, what's important is that both priest and congregation face the rising sun together. And in sacred art, nowhere is light more symbolically significant than in stained glass. By the very nature of its medium, stained glass is light transformed. It symbolizes God who is revealed to us in Christ. So there's some overview of some basic ideas, and I think it'll also be important. I'd like to set the stage for my discussion of windows and frames a little bit further by giving some historical perspective. So with an eye toward the applications of stained glass, let's skip across a few historical keystones that illustrate the relationship between architecture and windows. Romanesque. Romanesque architecture is thick and heavy. The thickness of the walls was critical to holding up the weight of the building. As a result, the windows were relatively small. Here we see the Cistercian Abbey of Thornette. And notice how the stone flares or opens out around the window. This allows for as much light as possible to enter. It also reveals just how thick these walls are. Gothic. Stained glass is most strongly associated with the Gothic period. Gothic architecture grows out of the Romanesque, and during the Gothic period, patrons, architects, and stonemasons pushed the limits of engineering in order to make the sacred space ever brighter and more colorful. An important moment in early Gothic architecture takes place at the Benedictine Abbey of Saint-Denis. As abbot, Suger rebuilt the Basilica of Saint-Denis in the 12th century. He's credited with envisioning and overseeing the creation of a new kind of space, one that was open and filled with light. Walls are heightened and pierced by massive windows. Stained glass, which transformed the light, played an essential role in Suger's vision. As the sun arcs across the sky, large windows bathe the entire sanctuary in transformed colored light. To Suger, this new light had the power to move the soul and intellect toward God. Speaking of light's power to convert, Suger says, "The dull mind rises to truth throughout that which is material, and in seeing this light is resurrected from its former submersion." Classical. This church, now known as Santa Maria degli Angeli, was originally the Baths of Diocletian in Rome, and is one of the earliest and largely intact examples of ancient baths. The building was converted into a church under the direction of Michelangelo, and the windows depicted here take their cue from the bath's original windows, which are still there and you can find in other pictures. The window is a large semicircular arch divided into 3 vertical sections. This form of window was popularized during the Renaissance and is characteristic of many classical buildings. It's been called the Diocletian or thermal window, thermal coming from the Latin thermae for baths. Notice the treatment of the window. Here the exposure is kind of blown out, but there is a grille work of just simple rectangular fenestration, and there's clear glass. We see this window throughout Baroque churches, and we see it today in projects by architects working in the classical mode. Modern and contemporary. Today, windows in contemporary buildings are as important as they were in the Gothic cathedrals. The horizontal window that spans the entire length of a building was one of Le Corbusier's 5 points of architecture. And modern architect Philip Johnson argued, windows constitute a more important element in modern architecture than they have in architecture since that of the Gothic cathedrals. They are the most conspicuous features of modern exterior design. Their handling is therefore an aesthetic problem of the greatest importance. Here we see a monumental stained glass window alongside a massive elevation composed mostly of a curtain wall of glass. And for those of you that don't know, it's called a curtain wall because it actually hangs like a curtain. The glass is supported by steel beams at the top. In the story of stained glass, the growing predominance of artwork on float glass follows this modern and contemporary trend. I want to speak specifically to the United States and the neo styles. So in the United States, we don't have a Baroque church. We don't have a Gothic church. Nobody was here building them during that time. But throughout the modern and into today, there's a steady interest in what we call neo styles, particularly the classical and Gothic. For this, I need only point to my personal experience as a designer of stained glass windows. In projects from really just the last 5 years, I've noticed a significant increase in clients who want to achieve a collegiate Gothic style in their architecture and in their windows. The story of stained glass in the United States is relatively young, and within that story, the Munich pictorial style of stained glass plays a notable role. Although they're blown out here, these are Munich pictorial windows. We'll take a look at one of them in detail soon. This style originated in the Royal Bavarian stained glass manufactory established by King Ludwig in the mid-1800s. And from the mid-1800s into the mid-1900s, studios in Europe and the United States were producing acres of what came to be called Munich pictorial stained glass. Popularity of these windows went hand in hand with the preeminence of Neo-Gothic churches, advanced by architects like Ralph Adams Cram and Francis Palmer Smith, who I led off with here. And of course, there are many other architects working in this mode. Windows in these churches are typically set into intricate frames made of wood, which are meant to imitate the stone tracery of Gothic cathedrals. Some of the finer examples in America used terracotta. Munich pictorial windows are characterized by lifelike classical portraiture with lush background scenes, bordered by elaborate architectural frames consisting of arches, architraves, and pillars. They are romantic in feel. To make, they're technically demanding, and I think they're some of history's finest examples of stained glass. Demand for these windows supported a large and skilled workforce of artists, all trained in expert painting on glass. On the right is a detail of this window just to kind of highlight that architectural painting. And you can see in this picture how the arches of the wooden frame are echoed in the forms of the stained glass. The two styles, Munich pictorial window and Neo-Gothic architecture, make a happy couple. The wood frame and tracery at St. Anthony of Padua in St. Louis, Missouri, extend into the imagery of the window. This was in part a production strategy that allowed for a master design to be used in multiple window layouts. Simply shrink or expand the master drawing as needed and fill in the gaps with decorative borders. If you know where to look, in fact, you will see the same image, central scene, reused in various parishes across the United States. But it's also true that the architectural border depicted in the window performs a kind of illusionism that fuses the pictorial with the architectural reality. The border, absent from this graphite sketch of an Ascension window at St. Jerome in Chicago, Illinois. I think it's still there, you can go see it. This border is the piece that completes the illusion and brings window and architecture together. The border leads our eye from wall to frame to scene. In a sense, it helps us suspend our disbelief and gently enter into the image. You know, at its most elaborate, this style of window is not unlike the Triumph of the Name of Jesus, the famous ceiling fresco by Giovanni Battista Gaudi in Rome, where the church appears to open up into the heavens and figures move freely between the two realms. Like the anonymous medieval stone masons centuries before, who built awe-inspiring cathedrals, most of the artists who drafted and painted in the Munich style remain unknown. Emil Hoffman was one of these talented artists. Hoffman was based in Munich and worked as a designer with Emil Frey art class. The only information you'll find about Hoffman comes from memories passed on by the Frey family and a few correspondences found in the company's archives. He survived the Second World War and continued to design Munich-style windows as late as the 1950s. Some of his last designs were created circa 1956. You can see them at Mary Queen of Peace in Webster Groves, Missouri. Mary Queen of Peace was built in the years leading up to Vatican II. Stylistically, it's a modern building with tinges of neoclassical and Art Deco influences. Overall, the building features very nice materials: stone, marble, bronze, leaded glass, but it has little to no ornamentation. Now, for our purposes, notice the windows. The worship area features 14 rectangular windows. You know, like a classical building, the windows are situated in a clear story level and allow for ample light to bathe the entire sanctuary. The sills, jambs, and head of the window opening are squared off with no framing, just a plaster return, just a simple return from wall to window. This is a window opening with no frame. Here is Hoffman's Nativity window. His exquisite depiction of the Holy Family maintains the Munich pictorial figurative style, but the plain background moves away from lush realism. The landscape and representational setting typical in a Munich pictorial window is stripped away so that only the essentials remain: the manger, the lamp, the stable, and the star, and of course, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. Architectural borders are replaced by a simple rectangular grid of unpainted glass. On the right, Hoffman's preliminary sketch, I think, is more instructive of the shift in design. Here we see the artist trying out various forms of ornamentation that might be said to frame the window. Stylistically, the ornamentation is so different from the figurative work, you might wonder if the same hand designed both. And the stylistic difference, I would guess, has something to do with his attempt to make the window stylistically correspond to the modern plain, lack of a modern space with a different kind of language, a different kind of ornamentation. Ultimately, though, these border elements weren't retained, and instead the simple rectangular grillwork extends to the edges of the window, where it meets the clean lined plaster and marble-clad walls of the interior. In Hoffman's preliminary sketch of the Nativity, we see a continued conversation between art and architecture. As the walls and window openings become simpler, so does the window. Stained glass followed changes in architecture as a mid-century modern style gained in popularity. What are the architectural trends today? And how will stained glass respond? One trend we see today is the closure of many churches due to shifts in demographics, economics, and also due to growth and expansion. Closures vary by region, but overall, the number of individual parishes is in decline. Many of these are neighborhood churches. They're beautiful buildings, but small and aging. As a result, there's a steady and perhaps growing inventory of windows being removed from shuttered churches. We are seeing now windows that were once in conversation with a certain type of architecture removed from their original context. When repurposing windows, the challenge is to integrate them into a building that conforms to today's building codes and is constructed with today's methods and materials. In the worst cases, individual windows are chopped up to fit a new window opening, a new framing system. Information is lost, and the artistic integrity of the composition is compromised. In many cases, groups and series of windows are split up so that the theological programs are disrupted. And in almost every case, a window's relationship to the frame and therefore the architecture is greatly diminished. What last century's architects and artists enjoyed, we don't have at our disposal today, and that's a prevailing architectural style. Currently, two consistent elements cut across architectural styles: the aluminum frame and plate glass. The aluminum frame is an important departure from wood and terracotta frames used during the first half of the 20th century. For one, aluminum frames are limited to a handful of sizes and dimensions, and they're less easy to shape. Plate glass provides essential protection against water and weather. However, because of its reflectivity and scale, it creates a modern feel to the outside of any church building. In the case of new or restored Neo-Gothic architecture, plate glass that spans the full window opening detracts from the frame's many depths and its divisions. Historically, we've seen that developments in stained glass happen in response to changes in architecture. Heavy Romanesque walls, lofty Gothic ones, classical order, and more recently, retrofitting old windows to fit contemporary frames. But a recently dedicated church, St. Ignatius in Mobile, Alabama, flips this script. St. Ignatius acquired a full set of Munich Pictorial windows from a shuttered church and built their sacred space around the windows. The tail wags the dog, so to speak. Now, how the windows were incorporated into the architecture became an essential part of the design, and framing took center stage. St. Ignatius Parish in Mobile was dedicated on April 25th, 2021. It's very fresh. The Neo-Gothic building includes an old brick facade, buttresses, limestone trim, and a slate roof. The church was designed around stained glass windows that came from the old St. Joseph Parish in downtown Mobile. It was the previous slide. During this project, the stained glass did not need to be altered in order to fit their new frames, and the entire set was kept intact. The project also allowed for the creation of new stained glass in a matching style. Designer John Whedon of Emil Hoffman Stained Glass worked closely with the building committee, project engineer, the frame fabricator, to ensure the stained glass maintained its integrity and achieved a harmonious fit with the architecture. A major challenge was to recreate the look and feel of the original windows, including frames, while at the same time using a contemporary framing system that satisfied the Miami-Dade County Building Code. And this is in a hurricane zone, so it was a robust frame. As I outlined previously, wood tracery or a comparable framing system is important in the tradition of pictorial windows because it establishes an architectural framework for the decorative perimeter in the stained glass that borders the central scene. Additionally, frames contribute to the overall character of a building's exterior. For these windows, 3 steel tubes, 2 vertical and 1 horizontal, give the structure. Wood is then attached to this steel framework to achieve the necessary dimensions and looks, which were in this case based on the original frames. The wood uses a system of simulated dividing light spacers to shape the sight lines. From an engineering standpoint, each opening in the steel, not the brick, is treated as an individual window. So in this case, you have 6 windows. Even though in terms of the experience of the architecture, it's only 1 window. Whedon, designer, notes that this approach is consistent with construction methods used during the turn of the century. In such churches, we may think of the frames as being either wood or terracotta, but it's really steel that provides the structure to the window frame. Here we see a detail of a terracotta framing system used circa 1870. In this detail, taken during restoration efforts, the terracotta has been removed, and we can clearly see the vertical and horizontal steel bars that provide structure. Terracotta sections are then attached to the steel. From a practical viewpoint, the terracotta provides the steel some protection against moisture and rust. From an aesthetic viewpoint, the terracotta, like the wood at St. Ignatius, gives depth to the window and dimension and pattern to the building's exterior. Part of this is the placement of smaller protective glazing within the individual frame divisions, rather than a monumental glass plate that spans the entire opening. While protective glazing may be necessary to preserve the integrity of a structure, in this case, terracotta and steel, it adds a contemporary or modern surface to the building's exterior. On the picture on the right, you can notice how the protective glazing of the restored window covers the entire brick frame, brick to brick, and it catches the glare. And you can see how that's different than the unrestored window. Every project will have unique circumstances, but the frames at St. Ignatius provide a roadmap for successfully integrating traditional windows into a contemporary framing system. Contemporary, at least in terms of engineering. Whedon's solutions avoid common mistakes and provide a roadmap for successful integration of traditional stained glass and contemporary frames. The project made at least 4 important aesthetic achievements. 1, it set the set of windows stayed intact. 2, the windows did not need to be altered in order to accommodate new frames, so it maintained the integrity of the individual window designs. 3, the new frames are wood with similar dimension to the original frames. And 4, on the exterior, the reflectivity of the plate glass is contained within the sections of the wood frame, rather than spanning from brick jamb to brick jamb. Because the salvaging and repurposing of stained glass windows will likely become more frequent as parishes are closed and the appetite for traditional or neo art and architecture grows, we may see more projects where an entire church is built around its windows. If so, it may be time for the reappearance of the frame. In the case of reusing old windows, the frame is a critical component. If a repurposed window is not integrated with the architecture, it will unfortunately appear as archaic survival. Now, what can we say about new stained glass designed for a contemporary architectural space? Contemporary buildings tend to feature clean lines, rectangular windows with aluminum frames and large plate glass. A major trend in contemporary art glass, and perhaps the newest chapter in the history of stained glass, is the application of artwork directly onto safety glass by lamination, fusing, or glass melting colors. These techniques have come about in response to the predominance of monumental plate glass in contemporary buildings. We see this especially in public buildings such as airports. This approach allows for different techniques and modes of expression, and for that, it's exciting to see. I'll point out that this style of stained glass has 2 important characteristics that distinguish it from leaded glass. First, it has no lead cane. And second, a single piece of glass takes the place of hundreds of individual pieces of glass. In the United States, this new style of painting on glass has not found as comfortable a home in our sacred spaces as it has our public buildings. Leaded glass is still largely preferred in churches and chapels. This is in part due to the fact that many communities want their buildings vested with a sense of deep tradition. Leaded glass, by virtue of its materials alone, recalls the artistic traditions of the church reaching back centuries. Now, how can leaded glass be integrated into a monumental curtain wall of windows? This chapel is the spiritual center of a new state-of-the-art academic and mission-focused healthcare facility. Architects originally designed the chapel to be a single story, but SSM leadership insisted that the chapel be more prominent and larger. So the height increased to 2 stories. And I like to add that to my discussion of this chapel because I think it's really powerful. Surely every square foot in a hospital is valuable, contested over. And the fact that the leadership of this institution wanted to double the chapel size within the hospital is a testament to where their values are and how they see where they place the importance of spirituality. The chapel, although it's 2 stories, is intimate, it's small, it seats about 20 people. It's designed for live streaming to patients' rooms, as well as a small gathering in the chapel. It also features a balcony, accessed only by staff and healthcare workers. The walls are made of drywall, acoustic paneling, and wood panels. The window, as is evident, is a major feature of the chapel, making up virtually an entire wall that spans floor to ceiling. The window frame, I didn't show any details of it because it's not an exciting picture. It's just aluminum, simple rectangular profiles, and with square drywall returns. The overall depth of the window opening is roughly 12 inches. This is a deep window. I say window, but really there are 5 windows of 3 different widths. Now, if we pay attention to the space between the openings, you notice that while a Gothic window or a classical window is usually divided by muttons or divisions of even widths, here the width of the vertical divisions varies. The window spans the 25 by 25 foot south-facing wall. The stained glass is created using mouth-blown glass, lead, oxide stain, silver stain, and acid etching. Its bright palette allows natural light to enter the chapel where it casts rich colors onto the chapel floors and walls. The stained glass is positioned toward the interior of this deep 12-inch frame. This allows for a more continuous legibility of the image across the vertical divisions. The 5 openings are treated as a single window. My design strategy here started with color, because in this case, the effect of light and the need for composition to flow across all 5 columns was more important than the details. The thumbnail color study on the left establishes a structure for the massing of color and form that treats the window, all 5 openings, as a single window. The image bleeds to the edges and flows across vertical divisions. Now, this window is one of course, 4 walls in the chapel, like most rooms. The rest of the space is intentionally designed as plain. There are white walls that can be washed with light during the evening hours. This allows the entire chapel to function like a lantern or a light box. So from the outside, the stained glass window stands out against a copper and glass elevation as a sign of the hospital's Christian identity. Here we see how the chapel integrates with this exterior elevation. It's a small part of a massive 2-story window that faces a courtyard. The window runs almost the entire length of the building. Now, in thinking about the structure of this building, we can see that the hospital is supported by several massive columns, which are visible through the window. The building projects out from these columns so that the windows cantilever or float off the structure. In terms of the stained glass window and its aesthetics, because of its warm and bright colors, it meshes with the overall elevation here, the warmth of the interior space seen from the outside. And here, contemporary stained glass design made with traditional techniques meets contemporary architecture. I'm going to wrap it up for you all. When it comes to building churches, windows are a given. Every faith community and architect will choose between three choices: plate glass with or without some fenestration, repurposing old art glass, or commissioning new windows. No matter choice or style, windows and architecture should be designed together. If stained glass is going to act as a handmaiden of architecture in our chapels and churches, frames will be a key component. Frames should be more than an off-the-shelf specification. They are a design element that affects the overall aesthetics of a building and a major factor in determining whether and how the windows are integrated into an architecture. In the case of repurposed windows, the frame design is a key component in determining whether a stained glass window comes across as handmaiden of architecture or is felt as archaic survival. In the case of contemporary buildings, how we design frames will continue to influence how we design stained glass windows. Now, how will our designs hold up? We'll know first by how a community responds and interacts with it on a local level. And second, looking into the future, we'll know by how long it endures. And hope you all were able to stay with me.
Thank you, William. Would you stop the screen sharing so we can see people now?
Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I'm curious, the fancy frames that you see in the Munich pictorial style, do people ever take that kind of frame and put modern stained glass in it? Is that something that would work?
Well, I have not done that personally. I think, especially in Europe, there's many examples of that. I think one of the most famous would be the Richter window. I think most people are familiar with that. Now, whether or not you think that's successful, I can't speak for you. I think at a minimum, it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it presents some challenges. I think in a case like that, I think if it is successful, it benefits from a very good architecture that can stand up to the most beautiful artwork being placed inside of it. And it might even be able to stand up to the worst artwork being placed inside of it. You know, I don't know that we have as many examples of architecture here in the United States that can do that. But, you know, there's many architects who've joined us that might have some comments on that.
Yes,
but I think I think that gets to a question that I have. I mean, I focused on frames in this talk, but I think there's a bigger question in any project. To what degree do we call on tradition, and to what